Lakewood, Ohio looked peaceful from the outside. Trimmed lawns, American flags, neighbors who waved but never asked questions. From the street, our house fit the picture perfectly. Brick facade, clean porch, soft yellow light in the windows at dusk. Inside, I was already disappearing. I lived there with my fiancée, Lauren, and her daughter, Madison. On paper, we were building something steady. Blended family, fresh start, second chances. That's what people like to call it when the past still breathes in every room. I paid the rent. I covered the utilities. I made sure the fridge was full, the car had gas, the school fees were handled before anyone could worry. I told myself that was love, practical, unglamorous love. The kind that keeps roofs over heads and lights on during storms off Lake Erie. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with Madison. She had a math exam the next morning. Fractions scattered across her notebook like broken glass. She was frustrated. I stayed patient. I leaned in, walked her through it slowly, explaining where the numbers met and where they split apart. For a moment, it felt almost normal. Then Lauren walked in. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was flat, surgical. "You don't need to get involved," she said. "She's my child." The words didn't echo. They didn't explode. They landed quietly. I looked at her, waiting for a smile, a hint that it was just stress talking. There was nothing. Madison lowered her eyes to the notebook. I felt like an intruder in a room I paid for. "I'm just helping," I said carefully. Lauren crossed her arms. "I've got it." That was the first crack. It wasn't about homework. It was about territory. A line drawn in invisible ink. Over time, the pattern hardened. Paying for dance lessons? That was my role. Covering summer camp? Mine. Buying groceries, fixing the sink, renewing the insurance? Mine. But discipline? Not mine. Setting boundaries? Not mine. Having an opinion about curfews, grades, attitude? Suddenly I was overstepping. I began to understand my position in that house. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't a father figure. I wasn't even fully a fiancé. I was infrastructure, like electricity in the walls. Necessary, unseen, replaceable. If Madison spoke sharply to me, Lauren would say, "She's adjusting." If Madison ignored me at dinner, Lauren would say, "She's tired." If I suggested we limit her screen time, Lauren would stiffen. "You don't get to make those calls." But the debit card in my wallet made plenty of calls. Every month, my salary flowed into that household like a quiet river. Rent, after-school activities, field trips, gas, birthday gifts for friends. I never once asked to split it proportionally. I told myself that love meant stepping up without keeping score. But love without authority isn't partnership. It's employment. The realization didn't hit all at once. It grew slowly, in the pauses, in the silences after I spoke and no one answered, in the way decisions were made in rooms I wasn't invited into but funded. I remember lying awake one night, staring at the ceiling fan turning above me, and thinking something I didn't want to admit. If I stopped paying tomorrow, what would I be? And a darker thought followed. If I stayed paying, what would I become? That was the beginning, not the explosion. Just the first quiet fracture in a house that looked perfectly fine from the street. Remember that each part must contain strictly 9,000 characters. Make this part longer. Part 1, the small town, the first crack, and the invisible role. Lakewood, Ohio looked like the kind of place where nothing truly bad could happen. Tree-lined streets. Lawns cut with geometric precision. American flags shifting lazily in the wind coming off Lake Erie. On summer evenings, neighbors walked their dogs and nodded politely, as if civility itself were a religion. From the outside, our house fit perfectly into that quiet postcard. Brick front, blue shutters, a porch swing Lauren insisted made it feel homey. Inside, I was already vanishing. I moved into that house with my fiancée, Lauren, and her daughter, Madison, believing I was stepping into a future. Not perfect, not simple, but shared. I told myself blended families just required patience, adjustment, humility. I had humility in excess. I paid the rent from the start. Not because she demanded it, she never had to, but because I wanted to prove something. That I was serious. That I wasn't temporary. Utilities came out of my account. Internet. Insurance. The steady drip of groceries every week. I handled it quietly, like a man laying bricks for a house he believed he would grow old in. I remember the first time I felt the imbalance. Madison was sitting at the kitchen table, pencil tapping nervously against a workbook. Fractions. She hated them. The lines on the page looked like barbed wire to her. Lauren was in the living room, scrolling on her phone after a long shift. "Can you help me?" Madison asked softly. I sat down across from her. I explained the numerators and denominators the way my father once explained them to me. Slow, patient, repeating when needed. I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I was trying to be present. Felt natural. Then Lauren walked in. She stopped in the doorway and watched us for a few seconds. Her expression didn't explode into anger. Tightened, subtle, controlled. "You don't need to get involved," she said. I looked up. She asked for help. Lauren's voice turned colder. "She's my child." The sentence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Madison lowered her eyes to the page as if she had done something wrong. I sat there for a second too long, waiting for Lauren to soften it. To add, "I just mean I've got it from here." To smile. She didn't. "I'm just helping," I repeated. "I'll handle it." That was the first crack. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet correction of boundaries. But I heard what she didn't say. "You don't belong in this part." After that night, the pattern began to form like frost creeping across glass. When rent was due, I transferred the money. When Madison wanted to join dance classes, I paid the registration. When the car needed new tires, I covered it without discussion. But when I suggested she should finish homework before going to a friend's house, Lauren stiffened. "Don't overstep." When I mentioned that maybe her bedtime was drifting too late for a 12-year-old, Lauren folded her arms. "I'll decide that." When Madison rolled her eyes at me and muttered something under her breath, I looked to Lauren for reinforcement. "She's adjusting," Lauren would say. "It's a lot for her." Adjusting. The word became a shield. Permanent excuse. I adjusted too. I adjusted to speaking less. To offering advice only when invited. To watching decisions about the house, about discipline, about parenting, happen around me like meetings I funded but wasn't allowed to attend. I told myself this was temporary. That trust took time. That one day Lauren would see I wasn't trying to intrude. I was trying to stand beside her. But months passed. Nothing changed. I began to see my role clearly. I wasn't a partner in raising Madison. I wasn't a co-parent. I wasn't even a stepfather yet, just a fiancé with a checkbook. Infrastructure, like plumbing, like electricity, necessary when working, invisible when functioning, complained about when disrupted. The realization grew in small humiliations. At dinner, if I suggested we eat together without phones, Madison would glance at Lauren before responding. Always at Lauren. If Lauren nodded, Madison complied. If Lauren hesitated, Madison ignored me. Authority flowed in one direction only. I watched it happen over and over until it stopped surprising me. One Saturday morning, I woke early and made pancakes. It was a simple thing. I plated them carefully, even cut strawberries on top. When Madison came downstairs, she smiled. "For me. For us," I said. Lauren entered the kitchen minutes later. She looked at the table, then at me. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I wanted to." Madison sat down. Halfway through breakfast, she asked Lauren if she could sleep over at a friend's house that night. Lauren looked at me. "Is that okay?" For a split second, I felt included, considered. I nodded. "If homework's done." Lauren's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "She doesn't need conditions," she said lightly. "She already did her homework." Madison looked relieved. I felt corrected. Again. It wasn't just that I lacked authority. It was that any attempt to exercise it was quietly neutralized. And still, the bills left my account like clockwork. rent, dance tuition, after-school programs, new clothes when Madison grew another inch, gas for Lauren's commute. I never once asked to split percentages. I never kept score aloud. But inside I began counting. Not money, moments. Every time I swallowed my opinion. Every time I stepped back from a decision. Every time I felt like a guest in the very life I was financing. Late at night, when Lauren slept beside me, I would stare at the ceiling and think about the structure of the house. The beams, the wiring, the foundation. If one beam disappears, the house weakens. If the electricity cuts out, everyone notices. But when everything works, no one thanks the wiring. They just expect it. I began to sense something dangerous growing inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. If I was not allowed to be part of the emotional architecture of this family, then what exactly was I building? And for whom? The first crack had been quiet, almost polite, but cracks spread. They deepen. They travel through walls you once believed were solid. I didn't know it yet, but that moment at the kitchen table, fractions scattered between us, was the beginning of a truth I could no longer unsee. In that house I was needed, but I was not wanted. And there is a difference. A brutal one. If the first crack was quiet, the second one was louder. It had a name. Kyle. Madison's biological father existed like a myth inside our home. Not present enough to parent. Not responsible enough to provide. But powerful enough to matter. He showed up every few months, usually when it suited him. A Saturday afternoon. A birthday. A random dinner invitation that disrupted whatever routine I had tried to build. He never stayed long. But his absence carried more authority than my presence ever did. Madison spoke about him like he was a distant hero. Dad understands me. Dad says I'm mature for my age. Dad thinks I should be allowed to decide. That word never meant me. I paid for her school fees. Kyle brought movie tickets once every quarter. I covered her dental insurance. Kyle posted photos with captions about my girl and collected likes. I bought her winter coat. Kyle bought her concert tickets one summer and disappeared again. And yet, when she talked about him, there was weight in her voice. Reverence. With me, there was negotiation. I tried not to resent it. I told myself children cling to blood. That biology is magnetic. That maybe one day she would see consistency instead of occasional excitement. But even Lauren fed the mythology. Whenever Madison resisted something I suggested, Lauren would soften it with, well, Kyle has a different parenting style. Different. That word did a lot of work. Different meant uninvolved. Different meant free from consequences. Different meant I had to absorb the friction while he remained untouched. Then came Cedar Bay. It was a summer evening, warm and sticky. The kind where the lake reflects the sky like polished metal. Lauren had been invited to a gathering, neighbors, friends, wine on folding tables, fairy lights strung between trees. I paid for the food. I always did. I stood by the grill flipping burgers while conversations floated around me. Laughter, clinking glasses, stories about work and kids and vacations. Madison hovered near her mother and a cluster of women. I heard Kyle's name before I even saw the shift in Lauren's posture. One of her friends asked casually, "How's Madison adjusting to everything?" Lauren smiled. A soft, nostalgic smile. "She's strong," she said. "Kyle really understands her. He's the only man who truly gets her personality." The sentence moved through the air like smoke. I was 5 feet away, holding the tongs, paying for the meat. I don't think Lauren realized what she'd done. Or maybe she did. Madison nodded eagerly. "Yeah, Dad just gets me." I waited for balance. For something like, "And we're grateful for the support at home too." Nothing came. Instead, one of the women glanced at me and said lightly, "Blended families are complicated." Lauren laughed. "You have no idea." I stood there smiling mechanically, as if I had just been complimented. Inside, something hardened. It wasn't jealousy. It was humiliation. In that moment, I understood my exact value. Kyle was the emotional father. I was the financial infrastructure, the provider without narrative importance. I replayed the scene later that night while washing dishes. The words echoed in my head. The only man who truly understands her. Only. The word stripped me clean. What had I been doing for years if not trying to understand? Sitting through her school projects. Driving her to activities. Listening when she cried about friends. But none of that counted in public. In public, I was background. A sponsor. An unnamed contributor. When we got home, I asked Lauren carefully, "Do you really think Kyle's the only man who understands her?" She sighed like I was being sensitive. "Don't start," she said. "You know what I meant." I did. I meant less. Over time, the mythology deepened. When Madison wanted something expensive, she would say, "Dad thinks I deserve it." Lauren would look at me expectantly, as if I was obligated to fund Kyle's philosophy. I noticed a pattern. Kyle made promises. I made payments. Kyle was adored for showing up occasionally. I was tolerated for staying. The imbalance wasn't hidden anymore. It was celebrated. One evening, Madison refused to follow a rule I had suggested about screen time. She folded her arms and said, "You're not my real dad. You don't get to decide." Lauren didn't correct her immediately. That hesitation was louder than any insult. I stood there, absorbing it. Real dad. The cult of biology had spoken. I began to see it clearly. I was competing with a ghost. A man who didn't carry responsibility but carried identity. And identity wins every time if you don't challenge it. But I never challenged it. I kept paying. Kept driving. Kept funding dance recitals and field trips and boutique shopping days where Lauren would swipe a card tied directly to my account. I told myself maturity meant endurance. But endurance without acknowledgement becomes erosion. Cedar Bay was the turning point. Not because of yelling. Not because of confrontation. Because of clarity. I saw how easily I could be erased in conversation while still being expected to finance the scene. I saw how comfortable everyone was with that arrangement. Kyle got the title. I got the bill. And the worst part? They expected me to be grateful for the opportunity. The night I made the decision, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a door. I didn't threaten to leave. I simply opened my laptop. The house was quiet. Madison was in her room scrolling through something that would cost money later. Lauren was on the couch, legs tucked under her, watching a show I paid the subscription for. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once been told not to get involved. The bank portal glowed against the dark. I stared at the numbers for a long time. Rent, utilities, Lauren's personal card, Madison's dance tuition, boutique purchases, online subscriptions, gas reimbursements, small transfers labeled, just in case. Every line was a thread tying me to a role I was never allowed to define. You're not my real dad. You don't get to decide. Kyle understands her. The only man who truly gets her. The words didn't sting anymore. They clarified. If I had no authority, I had no obligation. If I had no rights, I had no duties. I opened a new account first. Quietly, cleanly, redirected my salary to it. Took less than 10 minutes. Then I began turning things off. Autopay for Lauren's boutique card, disabled. Streaming services, canceled. Madison's dance tuition removed from my account. The shared grocery card frozen. I didn't do it in anger. That's what surprised me most. I felt calm. Each click felt like reclaiming oxygen. For years, I had been financing the illusion of family while standing outside its emotional walls. I had mistaken funding for belonging. Now I was separating the two. When I closed the laptop, nothing in the house looked different. The walls still stood. The lights still worked. But something fundamental had shifted. I went to bed without saying a word. The explosion came the next afternoon. I walked through the door after work and saw them already waiting. Lauren stood in the kitchen, phone in hand. Madison leaned against the counter, arms crossed. The air felt tight. Lauren didn't greet me. "What did you change?" she demanded. Her voice wasn't confused. It was sharp. My card got declined at the boutique. I set my keys down slowly. Madison's eyes locked onto mine with something close to betrayal. I tried to order my dance shoes, she said. It said payment failed. Lauren stepped closer. Did you mess with the account? I looked at both of them. For the first time in years, I didn't feel defensive. Yes, I said. Silence. Lauren blinked. Why? I took a breath. Because I'm no longer paying for things I have no right to be part of. Madison's face tightened. What does that even mean? It means, I said calmly, if I don't get to be involved in decisions, discipline, or raising you, then I'm not financing it either. Lauren stared at me like I had just committed a crime. This is petty, she snapped. You're punishing us. No, I replied. I'm aligning reality. Madison pushed off the counter. You're acting crazy. I almost smiled. Crazy. For years I had worked overtime to make sure they never felt instability. I had swallowed correction after correction, dismissal after dismissal, because I believed stability mattered more than pride. Now that I withdrew the money, I was crazy. Lauren's voice rose. You can't just cut us off without talking about it. I held her gaze. Every time I tried to talk about my place in this family, I was told not to overstep. That's different. How? Neither of them answered immediately. Madison's voice came out sharper than before. Dad would never do this. There it was. Dad. I nodded slowly. Then call him. The kitchen went silent. Lauren's mouth opened, then closed. Madison looked uncertain for the first time. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I've been paying for everything, I continued evenly. Rent, groceries, activities, extras. But when I try to parent, I'm told I have no role. So I've adjusted my role. Lauren's face flushed red. You're being manipulative. No, I said. I'm being consistent. Madison looked at me like I had betrayed something sacred. How are we supposed to live? She asked. The question was almost childlike. I felt something twist in my chest. But I didn't step back. The same way you expect me to live, I said. Within the boundaries you've set. Lauren slammed her phone down on the counter. This is about Kyle, isn't it? It's about respect. You're jealous. I shook my head. I'm done being invisible. The room felt smaller. Madison's voice wavered slightly. You're just going to stop helping? I'm going to stop financing what I'm excluded from. They both went quiet. That silence told me more than their shouting had. They had never considered that the infrastructure might disconnect itself. They had assumed permanence. Lauren's voice softened, but it wasn't remorse. It was calculation. You know I can't cover all of this alone. I nodded. I know. Madison stared at the floor. Dad doesn't have that kind of money, she muttered. I didn't respond, because that wasn't my responsibility anymore. For years I had filled the gap Kyle left behind. I had compensated for his inconsistency while being compared unfavorably to his image. Now the gap was visible, and it scared them. Lauren ran a hand through her hair. You're blowing up the family. No, I said quietly. I'm revealing it. The truth sat between us. Without my financial support, the structure trembled. Without my wallet, the illusion thinned. For the first time, I saw fear in their expressions. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing comfort. And that was the moment I understood something brutal. They hadn't rejected me emotionally because they felt secure enough to do so. They had rejected me because they assumed I would never withdraw. They thought endurance was infinite. They were wrong. I walked past them toward the hallway. Lauren called after me. So what now? I paused. Now, I said without turning around. We see who the real father is when the bills come due, and I left them standing there. Not angry, not yelling, just confronted. For the first time, the legend of the real man had to compete with reality. And reality doesn't take credit cards. The house changed after that night. Not loudly, not dramatically. Silence moved in first. Lauren stopped asking how my day was. Madison stopped lingering in the kitchen when I came home. Conversations shifted into closed bedrooms. Doors clicked shut a little more firmly than before. But the bills stayed unpaid. 3 days after I redirected my salary, the landlord called Lauren. I could hear her pacing in the bedroom, voice low but strained. I thought it went through. No, there must be a mistake. I'll handle it. There was no mistake. I had transferred only my portion, the part that covered my name on the lease. The rest remained untouched. When she came out, her face was tight. "You really did it," she said quietly. "Yes." She studied me like I was someone she had misjudged. "This is going to hurt Madison." That sentence almost worked. Almost. But I had lived for years under a different version of that logic. That my feelings were secondary to stability. That my exclusion was a small price to pay for peace. That being tolerated was better than being alone. Now the equation had shifted. "I've been hurting for a long time," I replied. Lauren didn't respond. Madison tried Kyle that weekend. I heard the call from down the hall. Her voice changed when she spoke to him. Softer. Hopeful. "Dad, I need to talk to you." Pause. "No, it's not about school. It's about money." Another pause. Longer. "I know, but it's different now." The door closed after that. When she came out an hour later, her eyes were red. She avoided looking at me. Kyle, it turned out, had opinions. Sympathy. Frustration. But not funding. Reality does not respect mythology. Lauren confronted me again that evening. "You've made your point," she said. "Can we stop this now?" "This isn't a demonstration," I answered. "It's a boundary. You're tearing us apart." "No," I said evenly. The structure was already weak. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. She shook her head, pacing. "You're supposed to love us." "I do." "Then why are you doing this?" "Because love without respect becomes exploitation. Because I was tired of financing my own erasure. Because every time Madison said, 'My real dad,' you stood beside her in silence. But I didn't say all that out loud. Instead, I said, 'Because I can't keep paying for the privilege of being dismissed.'" The next week was harsher. Lauren's boutique account sent automated notices. Subscriptions lapsed. Dance tuition reminders arrived by email. The comfortable rhythm of spending without thinking began to stutter. Madison's tone toward me shifted from defiance to something colder. "You're punishing me for loving my dad," she said one afternoon. "No," I replied. "I'm refusing to compete with him financially while being excluded emotionally." "You're jealous." "I'm tired." That was closer to the truth. Tired of being the quiet backbone. Tired of being corrected in my own home. Tired of watching a man who appeared quarterly receive year-round loyalty. The real shift came when Lauren tried to restore the old balance without addressing the underlying fracture. She suggested we reset. She suggested I resume payments, for now. She suggested we talk later. Later. Later had been stretching for years. "I'm not shutting off the electricity," I told her. "I'm not refusing to live here. I'm just not funding what I'm not allowed to shape." "And if I say you are allowed to shape it?" she asked. The question hung in the air. It wasn't an apology. It was negotiation. "Allowed," I repeated quietly. She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Permission wasn't partnership. I didn't want conditional authority granted after financial protest. I wanted acknowledgement, respect. In the following days, something subtle began to change in Madison. Without the automatic safety net, she asked more questions. About rent. About groceries. About what things cost. For the first time, she saw numbers attached to comfort. She also saw Kyle's limitations. One evening she said, almost defensively, "Dad says you're being controlling." I nodded. That's one way to describe a man who stops paying for things he's told he has no right to influence. She didn't have an answer. Lauren, however, grew quieter. The anger drained out of her slowly, replaced by something more uncomfortable. Realization. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't threatening to leave. I wasn't cheating. I was simply aligning contribution with authority. And that forced them to confront something they had ignored for years. The legend of the real father thrived when the bills were invisible. Now the bills were visible. And Kyle wasn't stepping forward. 3 weeks in, Lauren sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where the first crack had formed. She looked tired. "I didn't think you would ever draw a line," she admitted. "That was the problem." Madison lingered in the doorway, listening. "I thought you understood," Lauren continued, "that it's different with a biological parent." "It is," I agreed. "Emotionally. But financially, responsibility doesn't disappear because feelings are complicated." She swallowed. "I didn't mean to make you feel like a convenience. But you did." Silence. It wasn't explosive anymore. It was heavy. Honest. For the first time since I moved in, Lauren didn't defend Kyle. She didn't minimize Madison's words. She didn't accuse me of jealousy. She just sat there. And in that stillness, something fragile cracked open. Not reconciliation. Recognition. They were dependent on me. Not just financially, structurally. But they had never wanted to admit it. Because admitting it would require granting me status beyond helpful. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me. The resentment had burned down into something steadier. Clarity. I stood up from the table and looked at both of them. "I'm not your enemy," I said quietly. "But I'm not your wallet either." Madison's eyes glistened. Lauren's shoulders sagged. The house felt different again. Not silent in avoidance, but silent in reckoning. The illusion had dissolved. And in its place was a question none of us could avoid. If I wasn't the real father, why did everything collapse when I stepped back? I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. For the first time in years, I felt free. And that freedom carried its own cost. So I ask you, was I wrong to stop financing a role I was never allowed to hold? Or would you have endured it forever, smiling quietly while paying for your own invisibility?